Okay, today my guest is Professor and Dean Srilata Zaheer. I will keep my introduction short to maximize our time with her. In the next 30 minutes or so, we'll talk about Shri as a person, Professor Zaheer as a thought leader and esteemed scholar, and finally as a mentor to many PhD students and junior faculty. For the sake of time, I will skip many of her accomplishments and give you a very quick snapshot. Srilata is a fellow of the AIB and received the Barry Richmond Best Dissertation Award from AOM, Richard Farmer Best Dissertation Award from AIB, Aldrich Haynes Prize for the Best Interdisciplinary Work from AIB. She was the consulting editor for JIBS, and she was the division chair as well as the program chair of IM division at AOM. And in 2018, she received the PricewaterhouseCoopers Strategy and Eminent Scholar Award for Lifetime Achievement in Scholarship from the IM division of the Academy. Thank you, Shri, for joining us.
Thank you, Ilgaz. It's great to be here.
Thanks. So, first question, what did you want to become when you were a child?
Well, that's a difficult question. I think I always wanted to be an architect. I was kind of artistically inclined, and I spent my childhood drawing pictures of homes. My father subscribed to Better Homes and Gardens. We lived in India. But I was fascinated by mid-century modern American architecture, actually. So I think I would have become an architect, but then my parents decided when I was 16 years old that studying architecture meant leaving the city where they were, and that they weren't very happy about that. So that was the end of that.
Yeah, look how it turned out in
Yeah.
the end. Well, how or when did you choose to be an IB scholar, and what was the point of first moment of awareness between foreign and domestic?
Well, the first moment of awareness between foreign and domestic probably happened when I had a summer job at Citibank in India. And I had an operations project, and it became very clear to me that the expectations of the head office, the culture of the head office, the pace of the head office was very different from the pace of the Indian subsidiary. And so that was my first sort of exposure, if you will, to a multinational, the difference between the foreign and domestic. My interest in IB scholarship came a little later. I was working for multinationals for a number of years, and then we moved to Nigeria, and I got a job teaching at the university in Nigeria. And at the same time, I also started writing for Business International as a correspondent. Business International is now part of the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they were trying to create the first ever country report on Nigeria, and I got a gig writing that. And between sort of interviewing people about what was happening in business in Nigeria for that report and beginning to teach for the first time at a university in Nigeria, I found that I really enjoyed all of that, the research, the teaching, and decided that that's when I wanted to actually get into scholarship, and international management was a natural place for me to be.
Wow. Well, I looked at your CV before the interview. You're number one in everything since childhood. It is like number one, number two in a billion people always. What's something not many people know about you? What is not something that's not on your CV?
Oh boy, okay. Well, I guess something that people don't know about me is that, my mother was a classical musician, classical Indian musician, and she was trying to train me to be a classical Indian musician. But very soon you realize that you can't really learn anything from your parents, whether it's driving or classical music. So I didn't go in that direction. I still enjoy
Interesting.
listening though.
Do you play anything?
Not anymore. No.
If you stop doing what you're doing today, what is the second best alternative career path?
You mean at this point in time, or do you mean what would have
At
been,
this point in time?
at this point in time? At this point in time, I think I would probably continue advising companies. I don't see myself disconnecting from the world of international business in any significant way. But if I had time, I'd go back to some of my early artistic pursuits. I'd probably want to paint more, but
Hmm.
I'll have to see if I can make time for that.
Shri, let's talk about regrets. What is one thing that you wish you would have done, but you didn't?
Well, I think the one regret I do have is that I wish I had learned Mandarin earlier on in life. I love languages. I just like to dabble in languages a lot, but it's usually the travel languages. Before I go somewhere, I try and pick up something so that I can, make my way around. But Mandarin is a difficult language, and I wish I had learned it when I was younger.
Thank you. Now, what are you most passionate about?
You know, I think what really I'm passionate about is seeing my students succeed. I mean, one of the biggest joys for me has been seeing someone like Tatiana Kostova, who was my very first PhD student, go on to become a university professor at South Carolina. That leaves you feeling so happy that someone you kind of guided early on has soared and gone beyond you. And I think that's a great joy, and I'm passionate about trying to help our students really realize their full potential, whether it's our undergrads or our graduates, and particularly I think our doctoral students in the profession that we're in.
So we're now switching gears to research component.
Mhm.
I start this question as, imagine you're stranded in a pub somewhere that you're going to talk to these locals. No, but the idea is, how do you explain your research to laymen and people who don't regularly read you, or they don't really cite you? How do you explain yourself? What do you do?
Well, I'd probably start with saying something like, imagine that a stranger came into the pub, a foreigner came into this pub, and and just had recently settled in your town. What do you think that foreigner would face? What would they need to learn about your community, your town, and how could they build trust with with the folks in your town so that they become accepted like the way a local would be accepted. I just study that, but not about individuals. I study that about firms, about foreign firms coming into a foreign land and figuring out how to manage there.
Mhm. Um, what are some of the omitted variables or forgotten variables in IB research?
Oh, I think that's a very interesting question. I think at different levels of analysis, there are many things that I wouldn't know. I wouldn't say that maybe they're omitted variables. They're probably understudied in some ways. Clearly, the context. I mean, for me, that interplay between context and strategy and performance, I think, is still not very well understood. And by context, I mean both sort of at the macro level, of course, the geopolitical context, the relationship, the influence of governments and so on, but also the internal context of the firm. I personally am very, I just love that meso level of analysis, which is the most difficult to actually do research on. But the, things like incentives and organizational culture and the tone at the top, all of that matters so much, and how these things, are evaluated in different contexts. I mean, do the values of the firm at the at the headquarters really how do they get recontextualized when you move to other kind of national environments? I think this interplay between national culture, organizational culture, incentives, strategy, performance, I think that's very understudied. I'd love
Hmm.
to see how we can study it better, especially now there is so much more electronic data, in terms of if you can get access to email messaging within firms, if you can get access to, there's so much more sort of interesting data that can be scraped off websites and so on, so and studied in with textual analysis. So you can even do large sample work at the meso level, which I think is very exciting. We couldn't do that when I was doing my doctorate.
Yeah. Um, I would like to talk about creativity, and especially given your record of these creative papers, what does your mind think of when it wanders freely in a state of um, idle curiosity? What do you think about?
Ah, Lots of things. I'm always fascinated by the international context, by the cross-border context. As I mentioned, I love to dabble in languages. And I'm always curious about how ideas, go from one country to another and how they've, traveled over time. I mean, one of the things I've been doing in this pandemic time is my escapist viewing is Korean television dramas. And and I'm actually fascinated by how many words in Korean are exactly the same as words in my native language, which is Tamil. So I'm actually picking up, words, and even the grammatical structures are so similar. And it's fascinated me. I mean, and I'm really curious. Was it a Buddhist scholar who took the language from South India, which is a Dravidian language? It's not even a Sanskritized language. To Korea, was it? I hear there was some Indian princess who married some Korean prince. Was that the source? I'm just totally fascinated by how ideas travel across borders. And in terms of creativity, and I think you know I think there are many ways to be creative in scholarship. If there are assumptions that you kind of make you uncomfortable, I would say double down and, just kind of question those assumptions. That's how I kind of ended up with some of my work. Of course, arbitraging ideas from other disciplines is always a way to be creative. I think I'm particularly think that one of the papers that's most creative of mine, which is not strictly an international business paper, but it drew a lot from my IB work, was my paper on time scales and organization theory in AMR. And it came about just by sort of thinking about, how does time and timing, influence the kind of research that we do, including international business research. And so I felt, that we really had a fun time working on that paper, the three co-authors that on that paper. And it was, so it was arbitraging ideas from music theory, from philosophy, all kinds of areas.
Interesting.
Yeah.
About the next 5 to 10 years of the field, where do you see the field evolving to?
Well, I think there are many directions it could go in. I think the field has been so focused on the multinational enterprise that we've missed the boat on certain things. For instance, we should have owned global supply chains, and I don't think the IB field has really paid enough attention to, what's happening in supply chains. I don't think with this new remote work from home that everyone is doing right now, I do think that there is a role to think about, how does the gig economy affect, influence the sort of organization of work worldwide. I think there are so at the micro that's at the micro level, but also at the macro level, I don't know that there has been enough work on the role of the multinational enterprise and more broadly international business on innovation. Again, this idea of how do ideas travel across borders? How do they change as they travel across borders? How does that spark innovation? How does that spark creativity? I think that's something that I'm fascinated by, and I hope there is more work in all of these areas.
I mean, I see that you're talking about an evolution of IB scholarship from the past to the current.
Yeah.
And there's always an interdisciplinary need for combining supply chain concept at a global scale. Is this a fruitful evolution? Are we losing something? Have we lost the origins? And we just ended up in too much of a day-to-day functional areas. Where do you see the evolution take us?
I think it's a great question. I was initially attracted to international business because it was, I had worked, as I mentioned, in multinationals before I became a scholar. And it was very difficult for me to narrow my interest down to a particular, discipline within IB. I mean, it was very hard for me to classify myself as a micro person or as a macro person because when you're working in an organization, you don't make those distinctions. And I think what did attract me to IB in the early days was that there was people who were, being very creative. There, we worked across levels of analysis, and that was something that and we worked across disciplines. It was just natural in the field. I think over time, the field has become a little more sort of narrowly focused. I mean, it's sort of the international strategy folks have been working more at sort of from an economics kind of perspective, and so more narrowly disciplinary, and also more narrowly focused in terms of the levels of analysis. Either it's at the firm level or at the interfirm level in terms of joint ventures or alliances, but it just hasn't, this idea of cross-level, cross-disciplinary work has died down to some extent, and I think we've lost something in that process. As I mentioned, I love that meso level of analysis. I think we need to do a lot more work trying to understand how cultures travel across borders, how firm values travel across borders. And these are things that I think are not being discussed as much, partly because the methodological requirements from journals have become so much more kind of focused on issues of things like endogeneity, which are important. But I think there are ways now to get around this. As I said, now there is so much data available. If you can somehow get your hands on it, if you can try and figure out how to scrape data, if you can do textual analysis, there are other ways to tackle these kind of problems. So I hope that we go back to looking at, within the multinational, we go back to looking at issues of context, organizational context in particular, as we go forward.
Which type of questions have we studied too much, overly studied, or overly emphasized?
Well, I don't know that there's ever such a thing as overly studied, right? I mean, there's always extensions possible, etc. Having said that, I think the field's focus on the large multi-dimensional multinational enterprise has been a bit of a challenge. I mean, I think there are and especially and questions like market entry and joint ventures. I think there's a lot of work that has been done. I'm sure there's more that can be. I'm not saying that this is the end of that story, but I do think that we need to sort of go beyond that and look at just very much more collaborative ways of doing business, which may not be as formal. I think we need to look at the micro individual level of analysis more. We do need to look at the values and things, what happens within organizations a lot more than we have. I would say probably the liability of foreigners too has been overstudied, but I'm not going to sort of say that there isn't more to be done, but it's but all these areas, and they're the field evolves with more and more work done in narrow and narrow spaces. But I think in the process we shouldn't leave. There are vast areas which we haven't tackled at all.
Thank you. Now we're going to switch gears towards the advice and the mentoring segment. What is the best advice you received when you were starting out?
When I started out, one of my problems was I was what one would call a slightly more mature graduate student, in the sense I'd already worked for a number of years before getting into a PhD program. So I didn't know that I needed to ask for advice. And that was probably one of the biggest mistakes I made. But I do think it's so important to, I wish I had known how important collaboration is, especially in your early papers. It's really good to work with others who know how to respond to reviewers, who know what to do. I think there is, ideas are cheap in international business. I've seen some scholars get very hung up about how someone else is working on an idea which they thought was theirs. There's there's much to be done between having an idea and actually, developing a research question around it and doing the research and getting it published. There's a lot to do along that process. So I think it's really important to collaborate and to collaborate with those who are smarter than you.
I mean, in the in your arguments, especially when you draw attention to meso-level analysis and meso-level papers that are different and that are needed in the field, it requires a lot of training. It requires a lot of resources, capabilities, tooling, right? And you should also get a very good editor, associate editor, be very lucky with your 3 referees who are equally trained. So which skills are most difficult to develop? What
I
is the
think
investment?
I think the most important skill and one that's hardest to develop is to be able to find research questions that are high impact, in the discipline as well as, important for practice or policy. I mean, how do you find research questions that actually matter? And I would strongly urge our doctoral students to spend some time in the field, talk to people in the field, because, and when I mean in the field, I mean actually doing field work in companies, to do field work in other countries, to, start getting ideas for questions which actually matter, and that you also have some interest from an academic disciplinary perspective. I think that's the hardest skill to develop. And if you get that right, I think all the other stuff, writing, doing the research, getting the right reviewers, getting them to accept it. I think if you are doing high impact work, there's a, much better chance that you will be successful, even in the publication process, and in your career as you go forward.
Um, over the years, you've seen many students,
Right.
and you've seen them make a lot of mistakes. What are the top 3 big mistakes that people usually do?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's so many mistakes, that I've made myself, But I think it's really important to keep a sense of humility about your work. I've seen people get very arrogant about the work that they're doing. Nothing is perfect. It's meant to be improved on by others. So I hope that people do keep that strong sense of humility. I think you shouldn't get too narrow-minded about the discipline, about your discipline. And I find sometimes people are just extremely critical of work that is not in their own, that does not conform to the rules of their own discipline. And I think you have to be much more open-minded about, what you can learn from people who take a very different point of view from yourself in as they study the same questions. And then finally, I think, the thing that bothers me a little bit is, I don't think, while you need to keep one eye on your career and making sure that, your publications hit and all the, the expectations of your institution are met, I think having an excessively careerist orientation, I don't think it helps you in the, too much in the long run. I mean, I hope you're entering this field out of great curiosity about the phenomenon of international business, and that's what's driving you, versus the number of citations or the number of papers or whatever it is that more careerist orientation would give you. I want, it's that curiosity, it's that this kind of being sort of intrigued by something that doesn't seem quite right, or some explanation you've heard which you don't see in the field, things like that. It's these kind of paradoxes that you might get curious about, that I think that should drive the work that you do.
And any advice for dual career couples?
Well, I think it's really important. I mean, to be as successful in any field, but particularly as an academic, I think you have to have a situation where your home life is in balance. I mean, it helps greatly to have that in balance. And so, as I think, as a dual career academic, you want to make sure that your spouse's career is also going as well as could be, and that you sort of find an institution where, or a set of institutions or a city where you can both thrive. And I think that's extremely important. I mean, this having a happy home life does contribute to a successful academic life as well.
Final question. What is one question that I should have asked you but didn't?
Maybe something about, I think it's important to find an institution where the values of which fit in with your own values. I mean, if you're it's finding that right match can really elevate you. I think one of the things that Axe and I found at the Carlson School was just this incredibly rich intellectual atmosphere. I mean, I remember as an assistant professor walking into a senior faculty member's room, wanting some advice about some method. Someone said, go talk to this person. And this individual wasn't even in my department. And they said, he's somebody who really knows about this. Why don't you go and talk to him? So I just, landed up and I was, to have this conversation. And I was still there 2 hours later talking ideas. And it was such an interesting sort of and vibrant kind of intellectual atmosphere. And it suited both of us, both Axe and myself, very, very well. I mean, for those of you who don't know, my husband is also a very successful strategy professor. And so it's been a great fit for us. And I think this kind of finding this fit with the institution, that what you value is also valued by the institution, that you like that the intellectual atmosphere, you enjoy the teaching that you're doing, you really sort of look forward to sort of working with students, with PhD students as well as with undergrads and MBAs, and just sort of getting them to providing that kind of transformative education for your students. I think all of that, those values, if they match with yours, I think it creates it really elevates you.
Shreet, thank you so much. I learned a lot. I'm sure actually that the audience will also agree with me. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your answers.
Well, thank you, Ilgaz. This is quite an enjoyable conversation.